My name is Nadine, and I'm 31 years old. Last Thanksgiving, my mother slapped me across the face at her own dinner table because I wouldn't cancel my engagement and hand my fiancé to my younger sister. My sister smiled while it happened. She told me to stop being stubborn, that he had always wanted her, that I had only ever been useful. My mother raised her hand to do it again. None of them noticed the man standing in the doorway behind them. For 9 years I had paid this family's bills, covered their mistakes, and asked for nothing. They thought that made me safe to use. They didn't know I had kept every receipt, and neither did they know what Grant had already heard. Before her hand came down a second time, he stepped into the room. That was the moment everything they built started to come apart. But a moment like that isn't built in a single night. It gets built one quiet year at a time by people who assume you will never stop paying. So let me take you back to who I was to them long before that table. I clean teeth for a living. I'm a dental hygienist at a family practice in a suburb outside Dayton, Ohio, and I'm good at it. I remember which patients hate the water pick and which ones need to talk the whole time so they don't have to think about the needle. I'm the person people trust with the uncomfortable part, the part that makes them flinch. That isn't only my job. It's the role I've played in my own family for as long as I can remember. In my family, being reliable was the same as being invisible. If the mortgage came up short, I covered it. If a car needed brakes before winter, I paid for the brakes. If the water heater died in February, my mother called me before she called a plumber. Nobody ever thanked me, because in their minds it wasn't a gift. It was just Nadine being Nadine. And Nadine could handle it. Nadine always handled it. I kept a folder for all of it. Not because I was planning anything. I just have the kind of mind that likes a record. Every transfer, every check, every time I typed my card number into a form to fix something that wasn't mine to fix. I told myself I kept it so I wouldn't lose track. I didn't understand yet how much that folder would matter, or that one day I'd carry it into a room and set it on a table and watch it change everything. My younger sister Corinne is 27, and she has never once been asked to carry any of it. Corinne got second chances. I got the bill. She opened a little boutique with money I put in, $11,000, and it closed inside a year. There's still a photo on my mother's refrigerator of Corinne cutting the ribbon at the grand opening, beaming like the future already belonged to her. She enrolled in an esthetician course, $6,800, and stopped going after the first month. She needed a down payment on a car, $3,500, because the old one embarrassed her. Nobody called any of it a loan. They called it family. The strange part is that I never resented Corinne back then. I felt sorry for her. She was the one everyone worried about, and worry, in our house, looked a lot like love. I was the one they never worried about, and I mistook that for being trusted. It took me years to understand that they weren't worried about me because they weren't thinking about me at all. I was the wall they leaned on. You don't ask a wall how its day was. You just lean. I remember one December, on my own birthday, my mother called me at 9 at night. For one foolish second, I thought she was calling to wish me a happy birthday. She was calling because the furnace had gone out and the house was cold. I drove across town in the dark, wrote a check to the repair company on the spot, and drove myself home again. No one mentioned the date. I didn't either. I had learned a long time ago not to expect those two things, the caring and the calling, to happen in the same conversation. There was only one person who ever asked. My grandmother, Iris. She passed a few years ago, and I still keep her recipe box on my kitchen shelf, a battered little wooden thing with her handwriting on every card. Grandma Iris was the only one who ever asked if I'd eaten, if I was sleeping, if I was happy. When she died, I didn't just lose her. I lost the one person in that family who saw me as a whole human being instead of a resource to be drawn from. There's a folded note tucked in the back of that box, in her hand. For a long time, I didn't read it closely. I wasn't ready for it. I didn't know I would need it. So that was my life. Quiet, dependable, unthanked, and mostly at peace with all three. And then one Tuesday, my phone lit up with a text from my mother. "Can you come by Sunday? We need to talk about something." I read it twice. My mother didn't usually schedule conversations. When she wanted something, she just asked. Right there on the spot. And I said yes. Something about the wording sat wrong with me, the little formality of it. But I couldn't say why. I told her I'd be there. To understand what happened that Sunday and every Sunday after it, you have to know about Grant. Because by then my whole world had quietly gotten better, and my family had noticed. I met Grant Ellison at a diner off the highway, the kind of place with cracked vinyl booths and coffee that never really gets hot. I was there alone with a crossword. He was there alone with a stack of paperwork, and he asked to borrow my pen. We ended up talking until the waitress started flipping chairs up onto the tables around us. Grant is 34. He runs a commercial mechanical company called Northgate Mechanical, the kind of business that installs heating and cooling systems in office buildings and warehouses. He came up the hard way, wrench in hand, and he's the rare person who is both kind and careful with a dollar. He notices things. He notices when a number doesn't add up. And he notices when a person is tired in a way they've stopped mentioning. I want to be clear about one thing, because it becomes important later. Grant met me first. He met me long before he ever met my sister, long before my family knew his name. That fact seems small right now. Hold on to it anyway. In April, he asked me to marry him. He didn't make a scene. We were back at that same diner, and he slid a ring across the table next to my coffee and asked me what I actually wanted out of my life. Not what I could do for anyone, what I wanted for myself. No one had led with that question in years. I said yes before he finished asking, and I meant it in my whole body. I brought him to Sunday dinner the way you bring home something fragile that you're afraid the room will break. I was braced for my family to be difficult, to be cold, to find fault. Instead, they were warm. Too warm. My mother, Gail, hugged Grant like he was already hers. She refilled his glass before it was empty. She laughed at things that weren't funny. And then, somewhere between the potatoes and the pie, she started asking about his business. "So, Grant," she said, leaning in, "how big do these contracts usually get?" He answered politely. She asked another question, and another. She wanted to know about his margins, about growth, about what the next few years looked like for Northgate. My father, Dennis, sat at the end of the table and said almost nothing, which was normal for him. My father has always been a man who lets my mother do the talking and then nods along with whatever she's already decided. Corinne, meanwhile, laughed at every single one of Grant's jokes. Even the ones that weren't jokes. Even the ones that were just him being polite about the traffic. I told myself I was being paranoid. My family was finally happy for me. Wasn't that the thing I'd always wanted? To bring home something good and have them be glad? Then, as I was buttoning my coat to leave, my mother took my arm in the hallway. She said it would really help if I could cover something small, just this once, now that I was doing so well. "It's nothing to you now, Nadine," she said, patting my hand. "You're doing well." I wrote the check at the kitchen table before I left. The ink was still wet when I handed it to her. Another line in the folder I didn't know I'd need. Driving home that night, I noticed something I couldn't unsee once I'd seen it. My family's warmth had gone up at the exact moment my life had. The kinder they got, the more they seemed to be measuring me, weighing me, calculating. I didn't have a name for it yet, but I felt it, low in my stomach, the way you feel the weather changing before the sky does anything at all. If you've ever been the strong one, the one who paid, who stayed, who never got asked if you were okay, then stay with me for this. Because this story might feel like yours. And I would rather tell it to people who already understand than to people who never once had to hold a family up with their own two hands. The thing that turned the temperature up all the way came in July. Grant's company landed the biggest contract of its life. It was more than $1 million, 1.2 million to be exact, a real number. The kind that changes a small business overnight and gets people talking. It made the local paper. There was a photo of Grant standing in front of a job site in his work clothes, and a line under it calling him a rising name in commercial mechanical. My mother clipped that article and taped it to her refrigerator. She put it right next to the ribbon-cutting photo of Corinne's dead boutique. I stood in her kitchen and stared at the two of them side by side, and something cold moved through me. My mother had never once put anything of mine on that refrigerator. Not my hygienist's license when I earned it. Not a single thing I had ever paid for or fixed or saved. But a newspaper photo of my fiancé's money went up within the week, smoothed flat under a magnet shaped like a strawberry. After that, everyone was interested in Grant. Not in Grant the person, the man who borrowed my pen and asked what I wanted. In Grant the number. Corinne started orbiting him at every family gathering, sitting closer each time, touching his arm when she laughed. One evening, she asked him a question that stopped me cold. She asked, in this light, casual voice, whether, if anything ever happened between him and me, he'd still want to stay close to the family. Grant gave a confused little laugh and changed the subject. But I heard it. It didn't sound like small talk. It sounded like a question with a plan behind it, and I filed it away where I kept the things I didn't understand. At the same time, I started shrinking again. It happened the way it always had. "Nadine's fine," my mother would say, waving a hand as if brushing away a fly. "She's tough. She doesn't need the fuss." At one dinner, she quietly rearranged the seating before we sat down, so that Corinne ended up next to Grant, and I ended up across the table, watching the two of them from a distance. And then she said a thing I had never heard her say before, dropped it into the room casually while passing the rolls. "Corinne and Grant just have a certain ease together, don't they?" It wasn't a question. It landed like a stone in still water, and the ripples went out and touched everyone. I looked around the table to see if anyone else had noticed how strange it was, how wrong. My father was cutting his food. Corinne was smiling down at her plate, saying nothing, letting it hang there. My mother was watching me, gauging my reaction, the way you watch to see if a lie has landed and taken root. I said nothing. I didn't have the shape of it yet. But that was the first note that was truly, unmistakably wrong, and I couldn't pretend I hadn't heard it. The next piece came from Grant himself, and it came because he is the kind of man who notices numbers. He'd seen enough of my family by then to understand that I was the one who paid for things, always, without discussion. He didn't like it. Not out of stinginess, he's not built that way. He just saw a person carrying a weight blindly, in the dark, and he wanted to help me put it down where I could finally see it. One night, he sat at my kitchen table with his laptop open and a cup of tea going cold beside him, and he made me an offer that sounded like nothing and turned out to be everything. "Let me help you get all of this organized," he said. "You shouldn't be carrying it blind. Let's just lay the whole thing out, everything you've put in, everything the family owes, and get it clear." It's a small thing to say. It shouldn't mean anything at all. But for the first time in my adult life, someone was looking directly at what I carried and offering to help me hold it. I felt seen in a way that almost made me cry at my own table. I said yes. I said I'd talk to my mother about pulling the family finances together so we could all look at it honestly, out in the open. I made that mistake in front of my mother 2 days later at her house over coffee. I told her, cheerfully even, that Grant had offered to help us sort everything out, get it all organized, get it clear. My mother's whole face changed. It happened fast, like a light going out. "We don't need Grant going through our accounts, Nadine. she said. That's family business. Her voice was flat and quick. Her hand tightened around her coffee mug until the knuckles went white and the skin pulled tight. I remember staring at that hand, at how hard she was gripping a mug of ordinary coffee. I thought it was pride. My mother had always been proud, always hated the idea of anyone thinking we needed help, always kept the front of the house looking better than the inside. So I read it as pride and let it go. I shouldn't have let it go. Because why would a woman be afraid of a spreadsheet? Why would help feel like a threat? A few days after that, something else happened that I also explained away. A credit card statement came in the mail with my name on it. I was an authorized user on an old account, something from years back that I'd barely thought about since. But on that statement was a charge I didn't recognize. $5,200. I hadn't spent it. I sat with that envelope in my hands, the corner torn open, one line circled in my own pen, and I told myself it had to be a mistake. A mix-up. A billing error I'd sort out when I had a free afternoon. I told myself it was a mistake. I want you to remember that I said that because I believed it, and I wanted to keep believing it. Because while I was busy explaining things away, my sister was becoming someone I didn't recognize. And it was happening on purpose, by design, though I couldn't see the hand behind it yet. It started online. Corinne began posting photos of herself with Grant, cropped in tight so you couldn't see that there were 6 other people at the same table. She'd caption them with little phrases that hinted at something private, something just between the two of them. When I asked her about it, she smiled at me with what looked like real pity and said, "Some people just have history, Nadine. You wouldn't get it. History." Grant and my sister had no history. He'd met me first. I knew the timeline down to the week, down to the borrowed pen. But she said it like it was a settled fact. Older than me. And she said it so smoothly that I started to understand this wasn't Corinne improvising. Corinne had never been good at improvising. Someone had written this for her, and she was reading her lines. That someone was my mother. Within a couple of weeks, Gail began telling a story to anyone who would listen. She'd bring it up sideways, at dinners, on the phone, in the checkout line. "You know they met first, don't you?" she'd say about Corinne and Grant. "Some things are just meant to be." She even took an old group photo, one where Grant happened to be standing near Corinne, only because that's where the empty chair had been, and she started describing it like it was proof of a connection. A spark, a destiny. I knew it was fabricated. Every single word of it. But knowing a thing is a lie doesn't tell you why the lie is being told, and that was the part that kept me awake at night, staring at the ceiling. Why would my mother invent an entire love story between my fiancé and my sister? What did she think it would buy her? Nobody builds a lie that elaborate for nothing. Grant gave me the next piece without meaning to. One evening, he set his phone face down on the table between us, and then he told me, carefully, watching my face, that he needed me to see something. Corinne had been texting him. Things he'd ignored. Things he'd never once answered. Little messages that reached for him, that tried to pull him toward her. One of them said, "You always got me better than she does," with a wink at the end. And there was more than that. My mother had texted him too, more than once, asking him to spend more time with Corinne, to be sweet to her. Those were her words, be sweet to Corinne. Grant hadn't hidden any of it. He'd just kept it, the way I kept my folder, because some quiet, careful part of him knew it might matter one day. I looked at those messages glowing on his screen and felt the ground shift under me. This wasn't jealousy. This wasn't a lonely sister with a harmless crush. This was organized. My mother and my sister were building a story, brick by careful brick, and they were building it towards something with a shape and a purpose. I just didn't know what yet. So I did the only thing I've ever known how to do when the ground moves. I got quiet and I started collecting. For the first time in 9 years, I sat down and actually looked at my own life. I opened the folder all the way. I pulled every transfer, every check, every emergency I had quietly solved in the dark. And I added it up, line by line at my kitchen table, late, with the house silent around me. 9 years, $62,000. I sat there and read that number until it stopped looking like money and started looking like my 20s. $62,000 I had poured into people who put a newspaper clipping of someone else's success on their refrigerator and left mine off. It knocked the wind out of me. I had to put the pen down and breathe. But it also did something else, something colder and clearer. It made me want to know where all of it had really gone. Because the mortgage help, the shortfalls I had covered on the family house over the years, those numbers didn't quite line up with what I'd been told the house needed. The math had a hole in it, and I'd never looked long enough to find it. Grant helped me look, and Grant, being exactly who he is, found it. There was a second loan against my parents' house. A line of credit, $38,000, taken out quietly against the same house I had been helping pay for all these years. My mother's name was on the signature line, in her own careful cursive. I had been sending money to keep that house afloat, and the whole time she had been borrowing against it behind my back, turning the roof over her head into cash while I patched the shortfalls she claimed the roof still had. "Nadine," Grant said, very gently, turning the laptop toward me so I could see it with my own eyes. "There's a second loan against the house. Did you know?" I didn't. Of course I didn't. And in that moment, sitting in front of a loan document with my mother's signature on it, every strange note from the last few months snapped together into one clear, ugly picture, the way scattered iron filings snap into a pattern when you finally hold the magnet under them. It was never about love. It was about keeping me paying and keeping Grant from looking. That was the answer to the question that had been eating me alive. Why invent a romance between my sister and my fiancé? Because Grant was the one person close to me who understood money, and Grant had offered to open the books. If Grant opened the books, he would find the second mortgage. He would find the charge on the card in my name. He would find all of it, every hidden seam. So I had to be separated from him. And Grant had to be moved somewhere they could control, somewhere he'd stop asking questions. And what better way to pull him out of my life than to hand him to Corinne, where my mother could keep him close and keep him quiet. They didn't want to lose Grant. They wanted to relocate him. And they didn't want to lose me either, because I was still the one who paid the bills. They wanted to keep the wallet and swap out the wife. I closed the laptop very softly. The kitchen light clicked off. I didn't say a word to anyone. I needed to be sure, and I needed to be calm. And I have always been better at both when I stay quiet and let people show me who they are. A week later, my mother called to remind me about Thanksgiving. And she mentioned lightly, almost as an afterthought, that she'd have an announcement for the whole family. Thanksgiving was at my parents' house, the way it always was. Same good china that only came out once a year. Same smell of the same turkey that had been going since dawn. And the same folding chair at the end of the table for me, because the matching dining chairs only went so far. And I was the one who could sit anywhere. I was the one who didn't mind. They gave me the folding chair again, like every year. I almost laughed at it when I saw it waiting there. A grown woman who had paid for the roof over that dining room, sitting on a metal folding chair while Corinne glowed in a real one beside my fiancé. Everyone was there. The aunts, a cousin or two. Corinne was radiant, practically vibrating in her seat. My father carved the turkey the way he did every year, in silence, focused on the knife. My mother moved around the table like a woman running a meeting she already knew the outcome of, refilling, adjusting, steering. I kept my hands in my lap, and I watched, and I waited. When the plates were mostly full and the room had settled into that heavy, warm quiet, my mother cleared her throat and said there was a family matter we should settle tonight. The table went still. She looked at me and she smiled, and she said it out loud in front of everyone, in that calm voice she used for scheduling and deciding. "We think it's time you did the generous thing, Nadine." I asked her what she meant, even though I knew exactly what she meant. I wanted her to say it out loud, where every person at that table could hear her say it. So she said it. She said it would be best for everyone if I ended my engagement, so that Corinne could have Grant. She said it the way she'd once scheduled my dentist appointments. Calm, final, already arranged. Like the decision had been made in a room I wasn't invited into, and I was only being informed of the result. A slice of pie sat half-served on the serving dish, the pie server still sunk into it, forgotten. The whole table waited for me to fold. Because I had always folded. Because folding was what I was for. I said no. I didn't shout it. I didn't stand up. I just said it. One word into the quiet. No. My mother slapped me across the face. The sound of it was enormous in that small room. My cheek went hot and then cold. A fork slipped off the edge of a plate and hit the floor with a bright little clatter. And nobody moved. Nobody gasped. Nobody stood up for me. Not the aunts, not the cousins, not my father, who kept his eyes down on the carved turkey. In that silence, my sister leaned toward me with a small, satisfied smile and delivered the line she had clearly been given. "Stop being stubborn," she said. "He always wanted me. You were just useful." There it was. The truth, dressed up as an insult handed to me across the good china. Useful. That was the word for what I had been to them for 9 years. That was the whole of it. My mother raised her hand to do it again. And that was when a voice came from the doorway. Grant had come to pick me up. He'd let himself in through the front, quietly, the way you do when you're early and don't want to interrupt. And he'd been standing in that hallway long enough to hear all of it. The announcement. My one word. The slap. The line about being useful. He crossed the room in 3 long steps and caught my mother's wrist before her hand could come down again, and he held it there, up in the air, in front of everyone. "I heard all of it," he said. "Don't touch her again." The room finally reacted. My mother tried to pull her hand free and rearrange her face into something dignified, something in charge. Corinne's smile fell right off. My father half rose from his chair and then sat back down, because sitting back down is what my father does when the moment asks him to stand. Grant didn't yell. He didn't threaten. He just kept his hand around my mother's wrist for 1 more second, steady, then let it go, and turned to me, and asked me if I was ready to leave. I stood up. I left the folding chair where it was, pushed back at its crooked angle. He handed me my coat, and we walked out the front door together while my family sat frozen around a table full of food that nobody was going to eat now. We got into his car and he pulled out onto the road, and neither of us said anything for a long time. My cheek still stung in the cold. The heater rattled. I could see my own breath fogging the window, and I kept touching the ring on my finger to remind myself it was real, that he was real, that I hadn't imagined the one good thing. "You don't have to explain anything," Grant said finally, his eyes on the road. "I'm not going anywhere." And I realized, sitting in that cold car with the streetlights sliding by, that the family I had spent $62,000 and 9 years trying to hold together had just tried to trade away the one person who had ever asked me what I wanted. And I had almost let them. That was the thought that shook me hardest, harder than the slap. If I had been the woman I was a year ago, I might have folded to keep the peace, and I would have handed them the only good thing I had, wrapped up and apologizing for the trouble. I didn't cry in that car. I want you to know that. I had cried plenty of quiet tears over that family across the years, in locked bathrooms, in parking lots, in places where no one could ever use them against me. But not that night. That night, I just sat very still and let the fact settle into me like cold water finding its level. They had shown me exactly who they were, all the way down to the bone. And I had finally let myself see it. Grant didn't take me back to my apartment. He took me to his mother's house. Colleen Ellison opened the door in her robe, took one look at my face in the porch light, and didn't ask a single question. She just stepped back to let me in. She put the kettle on. She made up the guest bed with her own hands while I sat there useless for once. She set a hand on my shoulder and said the thing I will never forget as long as I live. "You don't owe me the story," she said. "Just rest." I sat on the edge of that made-up guest bed with a cup of tea I couldn't quite drink, and I set my grandmother's recipe box on the nightstand because I'd grabbed it off my kitchen shelf days ago on the way out of my own apartment without fully knowing why. A house that asked nothing of me. I didn't know a house could feel like that. I didn't know I was allowed to be somewhere and not owe it anything. Colleen didn't hover, and she didn't pry. She left a glass of water by the bed and turned the hall light off so it wouldn't shine under the door. In the morning, there was coffee, and she poured me a cup without asking whether I took anything in it, and then she let me sit at her kitchen table in the quiet for as long as I needed. I had spent 9 years being needed. I didn't know until that morning how badly I had needed to be left alone and cared for at the very same time. And then my phone lit up on the nightstand. It was my mother. The message said, "Come to dinner Saturday. We'll fix this as a family." I looked at those words for a long time in the dark. My mother, who had slapped me twice in one night in front of everyone, was already summoning me back to the table. Not to apologize, to fix it. Which, in her language, meant to get me back into line, to get me paying again, to smooth it over before Grant got any closer to the truth she'd worked so hard to bury. Before I walked back into that house, I almost didn't. And if your family only calls you family when they need something, type "I see it" below, so I know I'm not the only one out here. Because I need you to understand what it costs to walk back into a room like that on purpose, with your eyes open. I need to know there are other people who've had to do it and lived. I went to that dinner on Saturday. But I didn't go the way she wanted me to go, small and sorry and ready to be managed. I went with Grant beside me, and I went with the folder in my bag. It was the 6th of December. My mother had turned it into an event, an occasion. She'd invited the whole extended family, aunts and cousins, and my father's older brother, my Uncle Ray, a quiet man who had known this family a long time and had never once seen the inside of its accounts. There were more chairs than usual crowded in around the table, borrowed and mismatched. She had staged a reconciliation, but I knew what it really was. It was pressure. With an audience she was certain would take her side. My mother smiled at me when I walked in and said, "See, family always finds its way back together." Like the slap had never landed. Like this was a healing, and she was the one healing it. I sat down. I set my bag beside my chair where I could reach it. And I let her run her meeting because I wanted every single person in that room to see, with their own eyes, exactly who was steering it, and where she was trying to steer. She started with warmth, all smiles and second helpings. Then she moved to guilt. She talked about everything they had done for me over the years, which was a remarkable thing to say to the person who had paid for the roof we were sitting under. She talked about how family forgives, how family lets things go. She looked around at the aunts and the cousins and built her case in front of them. That I had been cruel, that I had overreacted to a small family disagreement, that a good daughter would put this behind her. She reminded everyone, sweetly, of the time she'd sat up with me when I had the flu in high school. A story I barely remembered, and she told beautifully. She reminded them that Corinne was fragile, that Corinne had been through so much, that Corinne needed protecting. She never once mentioned the boutique money, or the course money, or the car. She was very good at this. She had been doing it my whole life, and watching her do it now to a room full of people was like watching a locksmith work a lock, patient and practiced. I almost admired it. Then she turned the key. And then she got to the real ask, the one dressed up in all that soft language about forgiveness. "Family forgives," she said. "You've always been the strong one. So act like it. We can put all of this behind us, and you can help us get the house sorted out, and we'll be just fine." Help us get the house sorted out. There it was, sitting in the middle of the table like the turkey. Even now, even after all of it, the point was the house, the money, the $38,000 she still thought I didn't know about. She set a serving spoon down against the dish a little too hard, and the sound cracked across the table, and I saw it then, the thin edge of panic under all that composure. I still didn't say much. I lifted my bag up into my lap, and I unzipped it slowly. I wasn't in any hurry. I had waited 9 years. I could wait another minute. And that was when Corinne, who had never in her life had to sit and wait for anything, got impatient. She had been so certain this dinner was already won, that I was already handled. She looked at me across the table, and with that same little smile she'd worn at Thanksgiving, she said the thing that turned the whole room. "It's not like he was ever really yours," she said, tilting her head toward Grant. "He was just how we keep things afloat." The table went still in a completely different way than before. Not the frightened stillness after the slap, a dawning one, a slow one. My Uncle Ray set down his glass, deliberately, and looked at his brother, my father, and then at my mother. Two of my aunts glanced at each other and then both looked at Gail at the same time, because Corinne had just said the quiet part out loud, in front of people who were never supposed to hear it. She had just told the entire room that this had never been about love, or a broken heart, or two people who were meant to be. It had been about keeping things afloat, about money. My mother's face flickered. She jumped in fast, too fast, trying to smooth it over, and in her hurry she made it so much worse. She said something about how they had counted on Grant to help with the house, and then caught herself a half-second too late. But it was already out in the air. The concern wasn't Corinne's heart. The concern was the house. And every person at that table heard the difference, heard it land. I didn't have to explain what my family was. They were doing it themselves, in their own words, in front of witnesses. All I had to do was let them. That's when I opened the folder. I did it slowly, and I laid out the first thing without a scrap of drama. I told them, simply, in a level voice, that for 9 years I had been the one paying, and I set the pages down on the table where they could see. Every transfer, every check, 9 years of it. $62,000. I said the number out loud, once, clearly, and let it sit there in front of the aunts and the uncle and the cousins who had spent the whole evening being told that I was the ungrateful, cruel, overreacting daughter. My mother said it wasn't like that. She said I was twisting things, taking things out of context. So I set down the second page. I told them, calmly, that there was a credit card in my name with a charge on it I had never made, $5,200. I asked her quietly if she wanted to explain that one to the room, or if she'd rather I keep going. She didn't answer. She had stopped being able to answer. Her mouth opened and nothing came out. So I kept going. I set down the third thing, and I set it face up so everyone at that table could see the signature line with her own handwriting on it. The second loan against the house, $38,000, taken out quietly against the home I had been sending money to keep. And then I told them the truth I had finally understood, in plain words, so no one could miss it. I said the reason they wanted me to give Grant to Corinne had nothing to do with who loved whom. It was because Grant knew numbers, and Grant had offered to look at the family's finances, and if he looked, he would find exactly this. So, I had to be pushed away from him, and Grant had to be moved somewhere they could keep an eye on him. I wasn't useful, I said, and my voice didn't shake. I was paying for a house you borrowed against without telling me. Grant spoke then, only once, and only to confirm the thing that needed confirming, nothing more. He said evenly that Corinne had been messaging him for months and that he had never once answered, and that my mother had asked him more than once in writing to spend time with Corinne and be sweet to her. He didn't editorialize. He didn't make it his moment. He just set the fact down on the table next to mine and let it lie there. And then, my father did the thing I never in my life expected. My father, Dennis, who had spent every year I could remember at the end of the table saying nothing and agreeing with whatever my mother had already decided, put down his fork. He didn't look at her. He looked down at the table, at the pages, at his own hands, and he said very quietly, so quietly, the room had to lean in to hear it, Gail. She's right. She's been covering all of it. The room turned. You could feel it move, physically, like weather finally breaking after days of pressure. My Uncle Ray looked at my mother the way you look at someone you thought you knew your whole life. My aunts sat back in their borrowed chairs. My father had just confirmed, out loud in front of the whole family, that the woman running this dinner had been lying and that the daughter she'd slapped had been telling the truth the entire time. My Uncle Ray was the one who broke the silence after that. He didn't raise his voice. He looked at my mother for a long moment, and then he looked at me, and he said, plainly, that he had known this family 40 years and had never once heard a single person thank me for anything. Then he pushed back his chair and he stood, and he came around the table, and he stood beside Grant and me. He didn't make a speech of it. He didn't take anything over. He just moved himself to the side of the room where the truth was, so everyone could see which side that was. My mother had no move left. She looked around her own table for a single ally and did not find one. Not her sister, not her husband, not even Corinne, who had gone pale and small and silent now that the story had turned to face her too. For the first time in my entire life, the person with all the power in that room was me. And I found that I didn't want to do anything cruel with it. I didn't need to. That was the strangest, quietest discovery of the whole night. The power I'd waited 9 years for, and all I wanted to do with it was leave. I closed the folder. I stood up, and I said the only thing that was left to say. I'm not ending anything of mine, I said. I'm ending what I do for you. I reached into my coat pocket and took out the spare key to their house, the one I had carried for years so I could let myself in whenever something needed fixing, whenever they called. And I set it down on the table, next to the untouched food and the pages that had told the truth for me. Then I put on my coat, and Grant stood up beside me, and we walked to the door together. I didn't slam it. I just closed it behind me, softly, the way Colleen closes a door on a sleeping house. And that quiet click was the loudest thing I have ever done. The consequences came, but not the way people imagine karma comes, all at once, cinematic. There was no lawsuit. I never called a lawyer, and I never called the police. I didn't need to, and I didn't want to. I just stopped. Without my money, the debt they had been hiding stopped being hidden. There were notices, real ones, for real amounts, that I was no longer there to make disappear before anyone saw them. Corinne, who had spent her whole life being caught before she could hit the ground, discovered what it feels like when no one is standing underneath you anymore. My mother learned that a story only works while everyone agrees to keep believing it, and after that dinner, fewer and fewer people did. My Uncle Ray stopped taking her calls. A couple of the aunts kept their distance politely, the way people do. Not all of them. Some stayed close to her, Because families are complicated and people believe what is easiest to believe and cheapest to keep believing. It was not a whole town turning against her. It was quieter than that, and sadder. It was the slow way people stop trusting someone once they've finally seen the seams in the story. Corinne texted me once, a few weeks after, a long message about how I'd torn the family apart, how I'd humiliated our mother, how none of it had needed to happen. There was no line in it that asked how I was. There was no line that said she was sorry. I read it twice, and then I set my phone face down on the table, the way Grant had set his phone face down the night he showed me the truth. I didn't answer. Some messages don't need an answer. They just need to be seen for exactly what they are. And I want to be honest about my own side of it, because a boundary can be exactly right and still cost you everything soft you had left. Some of them called me cold. I let them. I lost the family I had spent 9 years and $62,000 trying to build, and it turned out that family had never really existed in the first place. I grieved it anyway. You can grieve a thing that was never real. I did. There were nights that December when the quiet in my life didn't feel like freedom at all. It felt like a room with all the lights off and no one else in it. Then my father called. My father, who never calls. I looked at his name on the screen for 4 rings and almost let it go to voicemail, but I picked up. He didn't ask for money. That was the first thing I noticed, and it mattered more than anything he said after it. He said he should have said something years ago, and he didn't, and that it was on him. I should have said something years ago, he said. I didn't. That's on me. He didn't try to explain it away, or spread the blame around the table, or tell me my mother had her reasons. He just named it, and he took it, and then he was quiet. I have thought a great deal since then about the different kinds of sorry a person can be. There is the sorry that is really just fear of what's coming next. There is the sorry that only wants the guilt to stop aching. There is the sorry that is quietly angling for something, a way back in, a check. And then, rarely, there is the sorry that is simply true. My father's was true. It was also far too late. And both of those things were real at the same time, and I had to hold them both. So I did something in between. I didn't open the door back up. I didn't hand him a check, and I never will again. Not for any of them. But when he asked me, in his roundabout, halting way, what he was even supposed to do about the mess now, I gave him the name and number of a credit counselor. I wrote it on a card and I put it in his hand the next time he came by Colleen's, standing on the porch with his hat in his hands. A name for help, not a check. That is the line, and I intend to keep it for the rest of my life. He took the card. He looked at it, and he nodded, and he didn't ask for anything more. And when he left, walking back to his truck in the cold, I noticed something strange happening in my chest. The silence in my life, for the first time, didn't feel like loss. It felt like peace. There is a difference between the two, a real one, and until that winter, I had never once known it. It was late December when I finally read my grandmother's note. I had carried that recipe box from my apartment to Colleen's guest room and never quite opened it all the way. But one quiet evening, with the snow coming down soft outside the window, I slid the folded card out of the back where it had lived for years, tucked behind the recipe for her apple cake. Iris's handwriting, a little shaky near the end of her life. It said, "You were always the one who noticed, Nadine. Don't let them make that a burden." I read it 3 times, and then I cried, really cried, in a way I hadn't let myself cry through any of the rest of it. Not the slap, not the dinner, not the folder, but this. Because she had seen me, the one thing my whole family had used against me, my attention, my noticing, my carrying, my grandmother had seen as something worth loving, worth protecting. She had known, before I did, exactly how they would try to turn it into a debt I could never finish paying. And she had left me a note telling me not to let them. I had finally listened, years too late, at a dinner table with a folder in my hands. I had done the thing she asked. I just hadn't known I was doing it for her. Grant and I got married at the very end of that December. It was small. Just Colleen and Tessa, my friend from the practice who had watched me come into work exhausted for years and never once asked me to be less tired than I was, and a few other people who had earned the right to be in the room. We didn't make it a spectacle. There was no announcement, no audience to convince, and I made one of Iris's recipes for it. Her apple cake, from a card in that battered wooden box, so that a little of her was on the table with us. "This is your family too now," Colleen told me quietly, taking my hand just before it started. No strings on it. And I understood, standing there in a borrowed dress, that I had not lost a family that night in December. I had finally set down one that was never really mine and picked up one that was. The folder is in a drawer now. I don't need it anymore. I keep it the way you keep a scar, as proof of something you survived. Not as a weapon you're still holding in your hand, waiting to use. People ask me sometimes if I won. I don't think winning is the right word for it. I didn't get rich. There was no inheritance, no windfall, no dramatic reversal of fortune. I didn't get revenge, and I found I didn't want it. I got something quieter and harder to take away from a person. I got to stop being useful, and for the first time in my entire life, I was simply loved, for nothing, for no reason, with no bill attached to it. If you've ever had to choose yourself over the people who raised you, tell me one boundary you're proud of keeping. Somewhere out there, someone is reading this on a folding chair at their own family's table, waiting to be told they're being ungrateful, and they need to know that it's possible to walk away and still be full of love. I set a table now, in my own home, for people who ask me how my day was. That's the whole ending. There's nothing more dramatic than that. A set table, and only welcome faces around it, and a quiet, at last, that finally belongs to me.